Good morning, everyone. My name is Kay Jacobson. I'm a librarian at the Ramsey County Libraries, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Great Decisions, U.S. and China Relations. Um, we'll have Richard Leitch, and I probably butchered your name, Richard Leitch, talking in a little bit. And let me give you a little brief intro on him. Dr. Richard Leitch earned his BA in Eastern Studies from Colby College in 1985 and went on to earn a master's in Asian Studies from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign after a two-year career on Wall Street. He earned his Ph.D. in political science from Illinois in 1995, where he was a recipient of the Harriet and Charles Luckman Award for distinguished undergraduate teaching and the College of Liberal Arts Award for distinguished teaching by a graduate assistant. He has been a member of the Political Science Department since 1996 at Gustavus, where he teaches courses in international relations, comparative politics, Asian politics, environmental politics, and the politics of poverty. In 2000, he received the Swenson Bunn Award for Teaching Excellence at Gustavus, and in 2008, the Edgar M. Carlson Award for Distinguished Teaching. In 2012, he was included in the Princeton Review's The Best 300 Professors. He was recognized as an honorary Gustie by the Gustavus Alumni Association in 2024. His research interests include Japanese domestic politics and foreign policy, and he is the co-author of Japan's Role in the Post-Cold War World. A frequent speaker to off-campus groups, Leitch has given numerous presentations focused on U.S. foreign policy, U.S. China relations, and geopolitical issues. So today's program is brought to you through the co-sponsorship of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Minnesota, the Ramsey County Libraries, the Foreign Policy Association, and Global Minnesota. We are thankful to all of these organizations for making this possible today. I think that that's enough. Good setup. Handing things over to Richard.
Thank you, Kay. Let's see if my screen is still shared. Maybe I'll have to redo that. Okay, here we go. Let's try that. Let's go like this. Okay. How about that? Are we able to see that, everyone?
Looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kay and Grayson. This is my fifth or maybe even sixth time giving a presentation through Great Decisions for your group. And I thank you so much for inviting me all the times in the past, and especially for this morning's presentation opportunity. Thank you. Today, we are going to think about U.S. China relations in the new Trump era. And before I get started, it's just a reminder that this program is brought to you in partnership with Global Minnesota. Global Minnesota has a very easy to remember website, globalminnesota.org. You can see it there about the middle of the page, but especially important to note is I have it in yellow highlight. The views expressed by Great Decision speakers, meaning me this morning, do not necessarily represent those of Global Minnesota. So let's get started. The focus of this chapter, in my view at least, unfortunately, is nothing but conflict. There is no mention of cooperation or the potential for cooperation to arise between the United States and China. It's solely from a perspective of conflict and avoiding conflict at best, but nothing about shared interests or how we are going to manage differences or anything of that sort. So here's a very provocative headline. And I am assuming, based on the demographics of past participants of this group, most of you, if not all of you, including myself, lived through the first Cold War. I don't want to see a new Cold War. It was a moment of turmoil, of course. My life was very precarious, even as a person who was in the formative ages of life. I always thought that nuclear war could end up breaking out at any point. It's not the way that we should live as human beings. But if we were to see a new Cold War, what would that look like? And I guess maybe that's a thought question for the end of the presentation. But there are 5 themes in this chapter. The first is the economic competition in U.S. China relations. And when I'm referring to this chapter, I am referring to the Great Decisions book, which maybe some of you, if not all of you, have access to, or maybe you've read it. So Donald Trump, certainly a fan of tariffs, even before his most recent administration. This goes way back, decades, in fact. He thinks that foreign policy tools are limited, and perhaps the best one of all, maybe, is tariffs, followed closely by force. In an extreme sense of force, we are thinking about war now, using the military and its capabilities. But you can see what he wrote here, and this is during his first administration in 2019. Typical Donald Trump tweet. This is prior to Truth Social, of course, but referencing Obama and Joe Biden and a lot of all caps there. But tariffs are not going to make our country much stronger. That is certainly farcical to believe that that would be the case. You might remember this, Liberation Day, intentionally planned for April 2nd, not April 1st, because no one wanted anyone to think that it was an April Fool's joke. And then after doing some research, analysts realized that a lot of these numbers were entirely incorrect, but they were used, of course, for the photo op. But that didn't stop Trump, of course, from implementing tariffs. Now, if you have the guts and the steadfastness to follow the ups and downs of Trump's decisions to impose tariffs, it has not been an easy ride at all. He implemented tariffs, he decided to reduce them, he decided no tariffs at all, then they were back in place, depending on which country it was. It was certainly, again, a very bumpy path. And as we know, the U.S. Supreme Court overruled his unilateral authority to impose tariffs on trade partners. But this is important to remember. Regardless of what state the tariffs were in and what percentage they were going to be placed on Chinese exports, Beijing, as you can see there, said that it is not going to kneel down to the United States. And in fact, if you want to see a very provocative, propaganda-filled, no doubt about it, Chinese Communist Party video produced in the aftermath of Donald Trump declaring that Chinese tariffs were going to be applied, or U.S. tariffs on Chinese products. You can go onto YouTube and type in "never kneel down," and it's about 2.5 minutes long. But it's essentially saying to Chinese citizens and also others who are interested in watching it, there's always going to be a bully in every neighborhood. And in this case, it's the United States. And what do you do when a bully tries to bully you? Either you cower and you just succumb, or you put up with it, or you just say, we're not going to take it anymore. And it's pretty explicit that China is saying to others, look, we're not the only ones in this circumstance. Why don't we think about how to deal with this aggressive bully in the form of the United States? So again, it's called Never Kneel Down, and you can find it on YouTube. But of course, there is some reason why Trump is focused on China specifically. You probably can't see the bottom of this chart, so I blew it up for you. But in this image, and I blew it up for the next slide, but in this image, you can see that the United States has trade deficits with almost all trade partners. The few exceptions are the Netherlands, the UK, as you can see up there, very negligible with Singapore, Brazil. But then we go down towards the bottom of the slide, which I did blow up here, and you can see that China has the largest trade surplus with the United States. Or to put it in another way, the United States has the largest trade deficit with China. Now, the numbers here in this bar graph represent the trade deficit of 2024 compared to 2023, which in all cases is below the 2024 measure. What does that mean? That the U.S. trade deficit with every trade partner has increased between 2023 and 2024. And in the case of China, it was almost $300 billion. Now, one of the accounting problems here is that a lot of products that are exported from China are actually produced by U.S. manufacturing plants in China, but they still come up as a trade deficit with China, if that makes sense. So, yeah. Now, when Donald Trump proclaimed at the end of his most recent State of the Union speech, which was in January, as you might remember, he said that eventually the U.S. income tax is going to be replaced by tariffs on all products coming to the United States. Now, that is mathematically impossible. Why is that? Well, the individual income tax constitutes approximately 50% of all federal government revenue, as illustrated by this pie graph here. You can see 50% individual income tax. And here is the customs and duties. So this is where we would find tariffs. That constitutes 1% of the present federal government revenue. So when Donald Trump made that proclamation that eventually tariffs are going to replace the income tax, there was a broad group of supporters of that proposition who erupted in applause. But again, mathematically impossible for that to happen. So second theme of this chapter is the military competition between the United States and China. I found this article in 2000, and at the time, I thought, boy, this is really concerning. Now, 2000, of course, is 26 years ago, but I saw this, and this is an AP article, so it was syndicated. It appeared in many publications, but this is the local newspaper of Mankato called the Mankato Free Press. And it just shocked me to the point that I said, I have to clip this and save this forever, which I did, and I use it for presentations like this. But essentially, a think tank based in China was prognosticating on the future. And they said by 2030, so 30 years into the future, we expect that we are going to see direct conflict between the United States and China, military conflict, not a proxy war like we were familiar with in the earlier version of the Cold War, where rivals were fighting with the support of either the Soviet Union and or the United States. No, a direct military combat between China and the United States by 2030. And I thought to myself, well, how is that possible? And what can we do as people on the planet, as Americans, as Chinese who don't hate Americans, and as Americans who don't hate Chinese? What can we do to prevent this from happening? Or is it as if we are already marching to the drumbeats of war, and people are planning enough for war that it's inevitable to happen? More recently, you can see different administration. Antony Blinken, the former Secretary of State under the Biden administration, he made this statement in May of 2022. Well, you might think back on the calendar of world events. In February 2022, Vladimir Putin's military forces invaded Ukraine. And even that momentous occasion, that violation of sovereignty of Ukraine and other events that were happening at that time, that was not enough for Blinken to say that Russia was the number one threat of the United States. No, it was still China. He elaborates. You can see here, I'm hoping that you can read this on your screen. Now, it would be nice if there were somewhere in this Great Decisions book chapter where they did talk about how China and the United States could collectively figure out how to, quote unquote, solve challenges from climate to COVID. Well, you might also remember when COVID was the outbreak turned into a pandemic in the spring of 2020, China was very insistent that Taiwan would not have a seat at any meetings of the World Health Organization, even though there are plenty of virologists and epidemiologists who are experts in their field based in Taiwan. China just shut down that proposal entirely. So Taiwan was really not represented in any of those negotiations about how the global community could address and combat COVID. But there we go. Now we're into the present administration. Here is Marco Rubio when he was going through his confirmation hearings before the U.S. Senate. And you can see what the headline says there. Now this is a Republican administration. So in short, regardless of the administration and regardless whether Democratic or Republican, it seems that China is the number one threat of the United States for a variety of reasons. And here's Pete Hegseth. You can see what he says there also in the headline. Here's a word from the earlier Cold War, which all of us are familiar with, détente. You might also remember that a very uneasy get along to get along moment in U.S.-Soviet relations, where we recognized their right to exist and they recognized our right to exist, and we didn't have to agree with their values or how they would attempt to realize all those values. But we see that word used again in contemporary times. U.S.-China détente is teetering. Here is Xi Jinping, the leader of China. As you all know, the leader of China since 2011. He did serve in the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese military, and you can see there he's wearing military fatigues. We would never see Donald Trump in a comparable situation. Donald Trump would never be in a camouflaged military vehicle, standing atop that vehicle wearing military fatigues, first and foremost, because Donald Trump did not serve in the military, as you know. He had an exemption supposedly for bone spurs. And maybe in this case, instead of wearing military fatigues, Donald Trump might be wearing some kind of Jesus robe or some other garb that makes him seem like he's saintly. But yeah, so here we go again, another headline. Is the big one coming? Is the U.S. military underprepared or unprepared entirely for that eventual catastrophic event? I don't know. But again, if you say it enough, if you preach it enough, then maybe people are going to realize something, and maybe the ultimate realization will be conflict between the United States and China. You can see the headline there again, more lethal force to counter China threat. We are now designing weapons specifically for an identified target, an identified enemy. Well, here's a side-by-side comparison. The current, which it shows on the left of each side of this chart, the current was 2020. And then, of course, the future is represented by 2025, which is already past, as we know. But you can see the United States is status quo. Nothing has changed in either of those columns there for the United States, especially the far right one under 2025. We have exactly the same number of fighter jets in Asia that we did in 2020. Well, if you look at China on every one of those different categories, China has increased its military capabilities. Is that something to be alarmed about? Some people certainly would be alarmed about it. Now, I took this from, and I got the approval of people from Women Against Military Madness, an organization that is an anti-war organization, a peace organization based in Minneapolis. I have had some of my students have internships with them. They've always been very gracious to Gustavus, but each year they come up with a new accounting of how much the U.S. military budget is and at what cost. Not only the absolute cost, which is now more than $900 billion, but what about the cost as far as opportunity cost? So instead of using as much money as we are using for the military, what is the sacrifice? And you can see all of these on the right side of this screen. You can see all of these other things that are necessary for the United States government to function, and also essentials for citizens' quality of life. So if we were to kind of take some of this 895 billion and use more for education or the EPA or whatever it might be, would that make more sense? Who knows? But we also know that President Trump, in his initial budget proposal, said that the U.S. military budget should be increased to $1.4 trillion. And now that is just, monumentally different than 900 billion, of course. It's not an incremental change from one year to the next. No, that is just an enormous change from one year to the next. Will there be pushback? We would like to think so. At least personally, I would like to think so, but we will see. Well, this is dated, and I recognize and I admit that this is dated, but it's from 1998 from U.S. News and World Report, which at the time this appeared was a weekly publication, and it was probably the best of the weekly publications, including Time and Newsweek. That's just my own bias, maybe, but you can see what the headline says there. When people went back and tried to figure out how much it cost the United States to defeat the Soviet Union, only through its collapse, but defeat the Soviet Union in the Cold War, they came up with this about figure of $5.5 trillion. Now, that's just a ballpark. It's not exactly right, of course, but a lot of people would say, well, 5.5 trillion. And again, this is in 1998 dollars. A lot of people would say it was worth it. If we hadn't won the Cold War, imagine what the consequences would have been. All of us would be speaking Russian now, and we would be living under the autocracy, the oppressiveness of a one-party state, essentially. So there was no cost that was too impossible to overcome, as long as we can say we won and we have the freedoms that we all enjoy. Well, what would it cost now if we were really launched into a new Cold War against China? What would that be? $10 trillion? It certainly makes $1.4 trillion look like a drop in the bucket. And in no way am I saying that we should increase our military budget at all. But this is just something for us to think about. The United States still has the world's largest military by far, as far as the budget goes, not as far as people power goes. But you can see a slide like this would make anybody a little bit anxious if they're concerned about the looming Chinese military threat. It started out negligible and suddenly it starts increasing. Well, and this is dated, and I admit that, but what are we going to see 10 years into the future? Is China ever going to catch up with the U.S. military budget? No, that will not happen. But how much of the gap is it going to close? We'll have to see. Another sky is falling article. Have we let our military industrial might wither? Why is that? If that truly is the case, why is that? Why is that? I sure hope that none of your grandchildren or your children are going to have to shoot at somebody that they don't know personally. Even if they were to know them personally, I hope they would never shoot at them. But for our government to say, China doesn't like us, China represents a threat, you're going to go kill some Chinese people wherever they are on the planet. Many of you served in the Vietnam War. You know what that was like. And now we realize that we were protecting people in South Vietnam. Now it's been subsumed by North Vietnam and in the entirety of Vietnam, one-party state, no doubt, but it's essentially quasi-capitalist. And we were fighting to protect democracy. And we have plenty of students from Vietnam who have the freedom to come to Gustavus. And the lives that were lost, the 55,000 plus US lives, plus the people in Vietnam who lost their lives, and throughout Southeast Asia. For what? For what? I don't know. Well, that's my biased, my very peace-loving, my ivory tower perspective as an American person. But what about other countries that are near China? So it's kind of ironic that the Philippines is now asking the United States military to return to protect it from Chinese aggression. And what's the irony? Well, you might remember in the 1980s, the United States had two U.S. military bases in the Philippines. One of them was overtaken by volcanic ash. And when the United States said, well, that one's a done deal, we can never reclaim that military base, the Philippines government essentially said, well, why don't you just leave entirely? And the United States said, okay, you have the right, you're a sovereign nation state. If you don't want us to be a military presence anymore in your country, fine, we left. And that was 40 years ago. Well, now the Philippines is saying, come back. Similarly, so is Vietnam. Vietnam is concerned about Chinese encroachment. So is the United States going to protect Vietnam, protect the Philippines through some kind of military treaty? Or is it just going to be our presence that those countries hope will be enough to forestall any Chinese aggression? No doubt about it. The Chinese military has been very provocative by building islands, whether those islands had as their foundation shoals that had naturally existed in the oceans, or they built them essentially out of nothingness It's amazing. You think about the civil engineering, the structural engineering that goes into all of this. But China was told by the United Nations, you have to stop building these military outposts on these man-made islands. And China essentially said, thank you very much, but we refuse to stop and we're not going to listen to your authority. And so you see these, again, man-made islands that at one time were not at all threatening because they were shoals. They were not habited by anybody. And certainly they didn't have radar towers and listening stations and other things like you see in this photo. But if you were in that part of the world, of course, you would be very alarmed and wonder what are China's plans for this part of the world and more essentially for our own country. Here is the third theme of this chapter, Taiwan. And before I continue, just so we know, I'm trying to put a lot of ideas into a very condensed amount of time. And hopefully these slides will help you understand some things, if only through the illustrations and the headlines. But if you would like this PowerPoint in its entirety, please just remember my first name is Richard, like Richard Nixon, and I teach at Gustavus. And if you literally just type Richard Gustavus into an internet search, my face and my contact, including my email address, will appear. And if you send me your email and say, I want the PowerPoint, I will send it off to you. But this is an entire semester worth of ideas here, just Taiwan alone. But this is something to think about. Whenever the Chinese government feels that somehow the United States is recognizing some semblance of sovereignty of Taiwan, they become very, very concerned about that, and they respond in kind. So whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy, former speakers of the House of Representatives, visiting Taiwan, they said as private citizens, but something like that is going to set China off, no doubt about it. If our president says something about Taiwan, whether it's actually representing the US policy or if it's off the cuff, if it's interpreted by the Chinese government, more specifically the Chinese Communist Party, as in any way infringing on the one China policy, then China is going to respond in some way. And here, as you can see, this is essentially gunboat diplomacy. This is a Chinese naval vessel off the coast of Taiwan. One thing that's very concerning about the US relations with Taiwan, and concerning because it has never been made explicit, is what's called the strategic ambiguity of the Taiwan Relations Act. Well, after the United States officially recognized China as the sole legitimate sovereign power of both Taiwan and China, we also had to recognize that Taiwan possibly would not be able to prevent any Chinese aggression or defend itself from Chinese incursion of some form. So the United States Congress passed what is called the Taiwan Relations Act in 1979. And I put the most important parts of that act here in bold and underlined. And also you can see I have yellow highlighter. Well, again, what does this say here? It says that the United States has the right to send defensive military capabilities or sell to Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense capacity. Well, again, if you're the Chinese government, something that is considered by our side of this relationship to be defensive could be considered by the Chinese government to be potentially offensive. Not that Taiwan would ever think about invading China. That's not going to happen. But still, if you need a reason to provoke somebody, an interpretation might be a valid way to do that, honestly. But yeah, what does this say here also? Considered below, also here, repeated at the top, it says right here that the president and the Congress shall determine the appropriate action in response to any such danger. And almost that same wording is in the paragraph above, that this is not a unilateral decision of the president. No, it's not even a consensus decision of the president in consultation with the cabinet. No, this is not Pete Hegseth and Marco Rubio and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance deciding something. No, Congress has a role to play here. And this is what the law says. Well, we've seen that the law has been broken in the past with several administrations, not only the present Trump administration, but what would happen if in an event like this were to happen? Would the people in the Oval Office and the executive branch decide by themselves, we are going to take XYZ steps in response to China's aggression or China now attempting to invade Taiwan? Or do you actually go through the formal process, through consensus building in Congress and come up with a solution? By then, it might be too late. Who knows? But Joe Biden said, and I'll get to the next slide and show you, Joe Biden essentially said that the United States would protect Taiwan. And the Taiwan Relations Act does not say that. Well, regardless of who the president was, whether Democrat or Republican, you can see that U.S. support in the form of military capability of Taiwan has gone up and down. Depending on the climate, U.S. relations with China, what's happening throughout the world, whatever the case might be. But you can see there's a steady progression here of the Chinese military budget, represented by that darker line that goes across time. So of course, again, China is always going to have a response every time the United States sells or sends weapons to Taiwan. In this one, it's furious. You can see there. But here is the strategic ambiguity part, which for a lot of people, maybe they had heard of, but it was just lost among all of the different details of U.S. foreign policy. But Joe Biden had no right to say what he said there. He said that the United States would defend Taiwan. And that's not really true. He can't decide that unilaterally. Similarly, here he was when he was running for term 2, Donald Trump as candidate. He had no right to say that either. Yeah. Here's one, and I don't know if the sound will work. I sure hope it will. But this is U.S. Congressperson Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You might be familiar with her. Her name is often abbreviated AOC. She was asked at the Munich Security Conference in February or March, what would be the response of the United States to Chinese aggression towards Taiwan? And if you can't hear her, you can see, I think that there's
And should the U.S.
transcript.
actually commit U.S. troops to defend Taiwan if China were to move?
You know, I think that this is such a, I think that this is this is of course a very longstanding policy of the United States. And I think what we are hoping for is that we want to make sure that we never get to that point. And we want to make sure that we are moving in all of our economic research and our global positions to avoid any such confrontation and for that question to even arise.
I'm sure if she were on a game show, she would take the option of pass. And that's certainly a very pertinent question to ask, but she's not the expert on foreign policy and essentially doesn't know what the Taiwan Relations Act says. And she came around to some sort of answer, but of course she stammered along the way. It would be nice if it were very explicit that we would know what would happen in that event, but we don't know. This next article appeared in February. Again, why should the United States be in limbo at all? We have the right to sell or send arms to Taiwan. But of course, Xi Jinping is pressuring Donald Trump not to do that. And it will be interesting to see what happens when Donald Trump visits China next week. That will be Thursday and Friday. I'm sure that the issue of Taiwan is going to come up. It cannot be avoided. Now, how is it going to be posed? I don't know, like in what context? Is Xi Jinping going to lodge a complaint about the United States sending weapons to Taiwan? Who knows what it will be? But the president of Taiwan, William Lai, he is clearly anti-Chinese government and anti-Chinese Communist Party, no doubt about it. And that, again, elicited a response by the Chinese government when he won that election, rather handily, but anyway. So here's the next one, chapter theme number 4, political, informational, and diplomatic competition. Now, imagine if we really are living in the new Cold War, some of these small countries that had been overlooked before might be showered with attention. And that is the word right there in the headline, showers. So we might have a ledger, who's on the Chinese side, who's on the US side. And a lot of countries during the earlier Cold War played both sides of the fence, as we well know. And they were always trying to get a better deal from one side or the other, depending on the circumstances of the time. So now a lot of small island nation states, because of their proximity to China, are getting a lot of attention of the United States. Why is that? Well, again, proximity. But a lot of those countries have bigger issues to think about besides whether or not China is going to invade them. I think they're probably more worried about rising sea levels and if they're going to be existent at all decades from now. Who knew? And maybe this is a new acronym for you, CRINC. Who knew that there is this group of nation states? CRINC is short for China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Because the former Ayatollah, now deceased, was rarely seen outside of Iran, and most people thought he never left Iran at all during his time in power. But there are 3 of the 4 CRINC representatives there, and they have a common value. It's the shared enemy being the United States. Which is the worst of the 3 there? I'm not quite sure, and maybe that's just a dinner time chat for you to think about a little bit. But Donald Trump has a lot of enemies, and he tries to cozy up to some of these people who are not fans of the United States. And that just is very odd to me. So in other words, Vladimir Putin has made it explicit that the United States is not an ally of Russia, yet Donald Trump seems to be on the friendship list of Vladimir Putin. And the same with Kim Jong-un, as we well know. They supposedly exchanged love letters when they met for that first summit. Horrifying. We'll see what happens with Xi Jinping. So you might remember Deng Xiaoping, a leader for about 10 years. He was the architect, the visionary of Chinese economy. And his quip, he had many of them, but his most famous perhaps was "to be rich is glorious." And as a result, a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs became very rich to the point that they have double-digit billions in net worth. Now, this fellow was a property developer. He was a land developer. And how did he get that land? Well, there's a lot of corruption involved with the Chinese government officials at the local level and other things. But you can see at the time, his net worth was $43 billion. And all these people, Jack Ma, he's not a property developer, but you've probably heard of Jack Ma. But all these people who would be now the cause of Mao rolling over in his grave. What happened to equitable distribution of wealth and the private ownership, the means of production is just horrifying for Mao to think about, but that's what happens. Now we've got a lot of private entrepreneurs in China, and they have become very wealthy. Well, the assumption historically is that once people have acquired financial freedom, they want something else. And what is that something else? Of course, they want democracy. They want to say something about their role in the system. Now that they have a vested stake, economically at least, in that system, they want to be able to somehow influence the policies that are going to affect their ability to make more money. Well, at the early stages of this quasi-Chinese capitalism that started in rural parts of China, there were people who felt the first sense of entrepreneur values, entrepreneur benefits. And they said, they started posting character posters here. This is great. I like the fact that we are making money, but it would be nice if we could actually own some land, for example. And at the beginning of what was called the Democracy Wall movement, Deng Xiaoping encouraged the free expression of ideas until some of his underlings went along and read some of those posters and they said, "Oh my gosh, boss, it's coming back to haunt us. They're actually saying bad things about you and about the party and other things." And this was quickly shut down. The Democracy Wall movement is probably not remembered by most Americans, if any at all, honestly, except for people who are in the know about those things. But the events 10 years later, 1989, we all remember Tiananmen Square. Now, there are many explanations for why that resulted in the way that it did. not only the Chinese response to it, but why it started as a small reform movement of Chinese students, university students who were upset about policy changes related to employment. Essentially, that's what happened. So it started as a few thousand people, and before long, it morphed into something much larger. Nobody knows how many people were at Tiananmen Square in May and June of 1989, but some estimates were as high as 1 million people. Well, we saw the response by the Chinese Communist Party, and they shut it down. Anybody who wants to visit Tiananmen Square in June 2026, they're going to be asked for identification papers, especially if you're a foreigner. Why are you here? What business do you have? Blah, 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 blah. But anyway, going along here now in the historical timeline, in 2000, this was an important year in world history, but a lot of people don't remember it, but we are now dealing with the results of it. Prior to 2000, every year, as a result of the Tiananmen Square massacre, every year in Congress, congressional representatives would debate whether or not China should be given what was called permanent normal trade relations status. In other words, China would be essentially allowed to trade with the United States. And every year, there were congresspeople who used that moment on the floor of Congress to harangue and essentially embarrass the Chinese government. And maybe they had the right to do that. Maybe for good reason they did. But they said, don't forget Tiananmen Square. And also another thing, in China this, China this, China this. And every year, the Chinese government, of course, they're not stupid. They would hear what congresspeople would say about the Chinese government. And then eventually, Bill Clinton, I guess, decided that this was going nowhere, that every year it was just becoming more performative, and China was not going to change. China was not going to become a democracy, but it was time to face facts, much like Richard Nixon faced the fact that China had to be recognized over the Republic of China, as we know, Taiwan. So Bill Clinton essentially made China a candidate for admission to the World Trade Organization. And that's what happened. We don't remember this date, but I remember, and you remember, September 11th. Of course you do. September 11th, 2001 was this. And I'm sorry if that's going to stir bad emotions and memories in you. But when I think of the fall 2001, I immediately think of this. But 2 months to the day later was this. China now is officially a member of the World Trade Organization. The Congress has nothing to do with any of this anymore. China is now a member of the liberalized trade network of the world, essentially. It's a full-fledged member of an international organization that is somehow going to make trade easier between nation states. And this person, they don't have to listen to people haranguing them anymore. Okay, well, what happens as a result of that? As a result of China becoming a full-fledged member of the World Trade Organization, presently, it's actually more than 100 countries in the world have more than twice as much trade with China as they do with the United States. And just think about that for a moment. That means that more than half the countries on the planet don't need the United States as much as we might believe they do. They are more dependent on China. And if we were to have a new Cold War with China, which countries would join our side, which would join the Chinese side? There was nothing admirable about the Soviet Union's economy, nothing at all. But now China has a lot of exports. China has a lot of business relationships. No doubt. China also imports things too. No doubt. Think about all of the soybeans that are produced in this part of the country, more specifically in the United States. Think about pork, for example. There are a lot of parts of pigs that Americans don't find all delectable. Well, they get exported to China. Lots of products that we as Americans are depending on Chinese to buy from us. Well, again, there's plan Bs for China and a lot of other countries that don't involve the United States. This was mentioned in the chapter. I just thought I would put this up very quickly and quickly try to explain what this is. You might remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an envisioned global trading network that was going to include the United States. That was the belief. Then candidates Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who were vying for the Democratic presidential nomination, both had their opinions on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Originally, Hillary Clinton said she was in favor, then she was opposed. Well, the entire framework collapsed, essentially, and it was replaced by the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Regional, this part of the world doesn't include India, and it certainly does not include the United States. But you can see what countries are included in this. Longtime rivals, China and Japan, they're both on the same page now. They've liberalized economic trade, and the United States is entirely shut out from this. So Xi Jinping, you can see he's walking with somewhat of a swagger there. Maybe he has the right to have a swagger. He is representing an alternative to what was called Western-style capitalism leading to democracy. And you can see the headline, and I blew up this article so you can see the text. But yes, China is a new choice for humanity. And I put on the right here, or excuse me, on the left here, indicated by the red pen. Yep, China is an alternative to Western democracies. Now, I am so grateful and blessed that I can live under a democratic form of government, despite all of its flaws and faults. I know that. But gosh, I have so many freedoms that other people in the rest of the world are never going to experience in their lifetime. Well, guess what? If I'm an autocrat and I see Xi Jinping walking and swaggering like this and thinking about how his country, whether he was the visionary, he wasn't, Deng Xiaoping was, but whatever the case, hundreds of millions of people in China have been pulled out of poverty, yet they don't have democracy. If I'm an autocrat throughout the world and I hear that, I quickly say, I can do the same. I can replicate what Xi Jinping has pulled off in China, and my people are going to have economic opportunity, and they will be able to feed themselves, and they aren't going to be as dependent on the government, and they're not going to demand democracy. That's what I want to see. So why does it matter? Well, if you look at this demographic chart, the left is 1950, the middle is 2020, 2100 on the far right, representing the future. 5 of these most populous countries on the planet that will be in 2100, 5 of them are in Africa. They are not fully democracies. They are not. China certainly is not a democracy. Is Pakistan a democracy? Debatable. Is India? Well, not if you're a Muslim. It certainly isn't. So what's the point here? A lot of these countries are going to look to China for leadership. And again, these are the most populous countries on the planet, led by presently non-democratic forms of government. So yeah, all these Chinese autocrats love the fact that China is showering attention on their countries. The United States, somewhat invisible, honestly. So now we're changing gears. Here's the last theme of the chapter. You can see what this says here at the headline part, and I blew it up at the bottom for you. China says prepared to lead global economy if necessary. And what is the date? This is just days after the first inauguration of President Donald J. Trump. And already the Chinese government, through Xi Jinping, is saying, if China is needed, we will step in and fill the void that the United States, through Donald Trump's America First policy, has created. We will lead the global economy. This is almost 10 years ago now. Do you think China is in it for the long game? Yes, they are. They didn't just say, oh, this seems like something interesting to just throw out there and see who bites on it. No, 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 no. They've been planning this moment to take over the economic leadership of the world. Here's another one, Xi Jinping's superpower plans. Oh dear. This is right in the midst of the first Trump administration, July 2018. Here's another, China's message to America. We're an equal now. We're an equal now. No, no, China is not yet a superpower on most measures. It's not, but they think they're an equal. when the United States decided to bar Huawei and other network systems in our country, a lot of people said, boy, that's just sheer paranoia. What do you think? The Chinese Communist Party is listening in while you're on the phone, while you're doing work through the internet? Well, maybe we have a right. TikTok, stupid, waste of time. They figured out the dopamine hits that kids are using or getting, excuse me, by using TikTok. I've had so many students waste hours upon hours watching stupid uploaded TikTok videos. I also know a lot of small businesses in the United States depend on TikTok to announce whatever they're selling. I know that, but the Chinese government isn't stupid. They're trying to dumb us down, or at least our younger generations. And here's one that's even more shocking. Fentanyl. Until recently, the Chinese government said we can do nothing to stop the flow of fentanyl into the United States, which is absolutely baloney. It's preposterous because we know that the Mexican makers of fentanyl need those inputs from China. And the only way they were getting them was through the exportation of those products from China into Mexico. Look what this says. The headline alone, fentanyl seized by DEA is enough to kill all in US. And this is just the fentanyl that was seized by the Drug Enforcement Agency. Imagine all of the fentanyl that wasn't seized. And China knows it. China is making our country addicts, whether that's going to be narcotics, whether it's going to be waste of time, social media through the form of TikTok. Now we know that the United States government forced China to sell its share of TikTok. We know that. But still, China's not stupid. What are kids doing in China right now? You think they're using fentanyl? They've got a heroin problem. We know that, or maybe you didn't. But are they studying like crazy? Are they preparing for the great confrontation against the bitter rival United States? Who knows? But this was shocking when I saw this. I just felt so sad. This is kind of like the reverse of the Opium Wars, if you're familiar with the Opium Wars. We saw how that turned out. So yeah, China, again, led by Xi Jinping. Who is he putting in his positions of authority in his cabinet? People who are technocrats, people who have that scientific understanding, that rigor of hard science. Think about our cabinet appointees under the second Trump administration. Who are those people? How many of them are really scientifically qualified to do whatever it might be? And why does science matter? Because of the rare earths issue. If you're familiar with this, great. Keep it on your radar because it's only going to get more intense over time. But rare earth elements are things that China not only has within its territory, things that have to be mined, but also it processes more rare earth elements than any country on the planet. And rare earth elements are required. They're essential for maintaining our quality of life, whether that means technology, whether it means batteries for our electric vehicles, whether it's solar panels. There are so many things that require those rare earth elements. And it is certainly a problem because China has a stranglehold over those products. If it wanted to, it could just say, we're not going to export those products anymore to this country, this country, this country, which it is already threatened to do. And as you see there, is it going to last another decade? It could be longer than that. If you are familiar with what's happened in congressional politics, federal level government, we know that the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness has now been opened for mining. And that now, if it does happen, people at the state level are trying to prohibit that. But if it does happen, the only elements that they're going to be able to look for would be copper and nickel. But most people believe that there are rare earth elements located in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And so are we going to see full-on stripping of certain areas just to find these elements so we're not dependent on China? Who the heck knows? But this, again, it's continued recently where the United States government has had a ownership stake in private companies. In this case, the reason is the United States believes that rare earth elements are so important, not only for our quality of life, but for our national security, that the United States government has stepped in, not nationalized, but this United States government has stepped in and essentially bought shares in these publicly traded companies that are dealing with rare earth exploration, rare earth processing, and other things. Just because we're worried that China is going to shut off the valve and we will be without those elements. So, yeah. So here's my last one. Uyghurs. This I'm very, very briefly going to tell you about because it was mentioned in the book. And I feel like I have to at least explain a little bit what Uyghurs are, who Uyghurs are, and why does this matter at all. Well, this area in northwest China called Xinjiang, as I wrote up here, geographically, it's 4 times the size of California. And you think about how large California is. Well, this whole area was formerly dominated by an ethnic group called Uyghurs. Uyghurs are Turkic Muslim people, and they believe that their identity is far different than the mainstream or the majority population of Chinese, more specifically Han Chinese, who represent 92% of the Chinese population. Well, over time, Uyghurs have said, we want to be free of the Chinese oppression that we have to live under. And the Chinese government is worried that they might try to secede through military force, terrorist acts. We have seen terrorist acts by Muslim Uyghurs in the past, so it wouldn't be unprecedented. But the Chinese government has decided that they're going to give job skills to these people. I put that in air quotes intentionally, because people are essentially brought to these places where if they were supposedly going to be taught job skills, they would be free to leave. Well, you can see that there is a watchtower here. There is razor wire. There's fences. People who are in Xinjiang are just picked up for no reason whatsoever, brought to these places. Are they tortured? Are they deprived of their rights? We know some things about that. I won't elaborate on that, but nevertheless, the Chinese government says that they're trying to give them job skills so they will be able to have a productive life. Originally, again, as I said, this area of China was dominated by Uyghurs, but what has happened over time is Beijing has said to non-Uyghurs, more specifically Han Chinese, to go to Xinjiang because they will find more opportunities there. And the life is much quieter, and the life that they will have is not concentrated masses around you. You have more air and space to roam and whatever else. Well, now 45% of the population is Uyghur and 45% is Han Chinese. So the population of Uyghurs has been diluted, and this was an intentional policy of the Chinese government. Problem is that a lot of solar panels that we use in this country are produced in Xinjiang. Big problem. This is my last slide. These are girls who are Muslim Uyghurs. I received this from a friend in China. I will not reveal the source, but these are Uyghur schoolgirls who are at a boarding school. And they all are told what, I guess through a heavy dose of indoctrination, what China means to their lives. And they're replying to the person asking the question. And you will see, we don't have to understand Chinese at all because there are subtitles, but listen to what they say.
请你们用一句话证明你是中国人。
为中华之崛起而读书，
用心生于华夏。
我们应该要筑牢毛主席说过的一句话：要好好学习，天天向上。
如果青天有颜色，那就是中国红。
台湾是中国不可分的一部分。
我骄傲，我是中国人。
新疆是中国领土不可分割的一部分。好好学习，天天向上是我们的职责。庆幸自己生长在中国。古老的东方有一条龙叫做中国。
Again, what I find interesting is those kids would not know the word inseparable. But of course, one of those kids was told, you're going to say Taiwan is an inseparable part of China. And the other kid was told Xinjiang is an inseparable part of China. And if you give them a heavy dose of indoctrination, eventually they will believe it. So here is, through his assimilation plan, Xi Jinping visiting Xinjiang in the fall. And he's now successful. He believes that he's brought all of those Uyghurs under heel somehow. Look at the festivities behind him and all the elaborate pageantry. So that's the end of the presentation. It's exactly an hour since I started, and that's maybe a few minutes overtime, but I know we have until 10:30. So we could go beyond 10:30 if your schedule allows, certainly mine does. So any comments or questions would certainly be welcome. So thank you all for your attentiveness. Thank you.
Okay, so let's looking at questions we have so far. Looking at Chinese military equipment, we have a question. Is the effectiveness and sophistication of the Chinese military equipment comparable to the U.S.?
That's a great question. No, it is not. And neither is the preparedness of the military forces themselves. It is undeniable that the United States military is the most prepared, most competent military fighting force on the planet. And we are also very lucky that we make a lot of our own military capabilities, whether those are naval vessels or fighter jets or the guns themselves. China has to acquire some of what it is using potentially on the battlefield from other sources. And what it makes homegrown doesn't reach the level of the quality of the United States hardware, that's for sure. But that's something very important to point out too. But also just on a tangential here, and just give me 2 minutes, the first aircraft carrier that China had was essentially off the shelf. It was an old generation Ukrainian aircraft fighter. And the United States said, oh, we're not so concerned about that. And someday maybe China will have its own aircraft carrier. And we just really weren't so perturbed by that. But China was able to build its own aircraft carrier almost in record time. And I guess they used that Ukrainian aircraft carrier as a model. And then they implemented new technology onto it. And now China has more than one of its own aircraft carriers that it developed. So it's not that China is technologically inept and so far behind the United States when it comes to military capabilities and technological abilities. So it's something that we're going to have to think about in the future, especially because the United States is having a difficult time filling some of those jobs, whether that's, engineering jobs and other things that are required to make those capabilities. So good. Thank you.
Okay, so to affect change in relationship with China, do you think Republicans or Democrats would have the best potential to decrease the tension in U.S. and China?
Oh, boy, that's a great question. Here's my full confession. I am not a partisan politics person, and for that reason, I could never run for elected office. But I know many people are partisan politics people for good reason, and I respect them for those reasons. But I don't think that there will be any difference between whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in the Oval Office or dominating Congress, quite honestly. I've seen the rhetoric or heard the rhetoric from both sides recently. There were always a couple of people who were considered to be friendly towards China, but now China has done so many egregious things that people would be suspicious of any congressperson who stood up on the floor of Congress and said, I think we should cut China some slack. I think we should trust China, because China has infused people working on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party into different levels of government, as we all well know, into corporate positions, as we well know, into non-government organizations, as we well know. They've tried to do for more than 2 decades, they've tried to give China a good spin by saying to colleges and universities in the United States through their what are called Confucius Institutes, we will pay for the salaries of X number of people who will teach Chinese language and culture classes at your college or university. And a lot of colleges and universities said, wow, this is free money, and this is a way to expose China to our students, and this will be great. Well, we found out also that you have to follow and sign off on a paper. You're going to agree to all these different provisions to get this money. And there's certain things you can't say and certain things you must say and blah, blah, blah. So China, again, to use a phrase I used earlier, they're in it for the long game. And they're trying to figure out how to convince Americans that China is really to be trusted. And most people are not going to trust China, whether they're Democrat or Republican, quite honestly. Across the board, the only people I see that are in the real pro-China camp are people who know people in China individually, you know, on a personal level. And for that reason, I hold out hope, because I know a lot of people in China, that those people are going to be the ones who are going to steer others towards this idea of, can't we all just get along, to paraphrase Rodney King. But the other people, you know, at the congressional level and in the Oval Office, I don't think it matters if they're Democrat or Republican, honestly. And it's mostly because China doesn't give them any reason to advocate for China. That's my sense of it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Let's go on to the next question. Will you address who or what profits from the incessant U.S. threats and warmongering
Oh,
against China?
that is a great question. Well, I guess we could, you know, personalize it here. We think about somebody like Pete Hegseth. Um, We know he was a very smart person, Forest Lake guy. He's one of us, I guess. Went to Princeton, certainly no dummy, served in the military. So he's certainly a very courageous person. But boy, that would look great on his resume, wouldn't it? If he could say that he increased the US military budget X%, or he increased our readiness, some subjective measure or something of that sort. But certainly to go back and use that Dwight D. Eisenhower phrase of the military industrial complex. You know, war makes jobs. Preparation for war makes jobs. Congressional representatives are able to bring home the bacon to their districts that have, whether it's going to be in Bath, Maine at the Bath Iron Works making naval vessels, or someplace in California that has a base, or it's someplace like Boeing in Seattle. If you can bring home that money to your district and provide more jobs, then of course that's great. Unfortunately, peace, even though it is prevalent in relationships between countries of the world, peace doesn't sell. Nobody's saying, let's sit down with these youngsters, except in exceptional cases. But let's sit down with these youngsters and prepare them for peace and prepare them to get along. It's not going to capture the headlines. Unfortunately, it doesn't. War is just a very, very good money-making endeavor, quite honestly. And you think about Gone with the Wind. That's what Clark Gable said. He didn't care about the South. He wanted to make money. Not a very good analogy, but, you know, somewhat similar. So yeah, there's a lot of people through Dwight D. Eisenhower's phrase of the military industrial complex who are benefiting for preparation for war. No doubt about it. And then you think about all the lives that will be lost and all of the property damage, destruction that's going to happen. For what end? I don't know. I don't know. So good, good. Thank you for that question about Republicans and Democrats. Very good.
Okay, so follow-up question here then. If push comes to shove, will ordinary Americans send their children to war for Taiwan? How
Oh,
much war propaganda will that require?
there's another great question. You know, I think our present military, which is an all volunteer military, so everybody is opting in, as we all know, for whatever reason or reasons that they're doing that. Is it the GI Bill? Is it benefits? Is it secure employment? We don't know, but they're all volunteers. So according to their contract, if the commander-in-chief authorizes their mobilization in a time of conflict or something, they have to go unless they become deserters. We don't have a military draft, so we're not going to have draft dodgers. Would I think that that would be a justifiable, I was trying to think of a good word here, a justifiable loss of life? Well, I'm not in the military. And protecting Taiwan, I guess, because of all of the assets that Taiwan has, especially in the form of Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, makes 85% of the semiconductors on the planet. We're going to protect that factory, because if we don't protect it, our quality of life is down the drain. Mobilizing US troops to protect Taiwan, primarily for that factory, the people in Taiwan. Honestly, I don't, is anything justifiable? I don't know. But again, the people who signed up for military service knew that that could be one of the decisions that's made, risking their life. So if push comes to shove with the US military, say we have to protect Taiwan? Yes. Would parents say, send my children to protect Taiwan? Well, those children, your offspring, have made an adult decision to serve in the military. And I can't imagine that the U.S. military draft would be restored to protect Taiwan. I can't imagine that. But I could imagine if we did see several military conflicts throughout the world, whether directly involving the US and China or through proxy warfare, I could imagine that there would be a draft that would be revived because we just wouldn't have enough people. Even now, the all volunteer military is not reaching the quotas that were needed by the military. So maybe we would
Well,
just expend people. Yes, please go, Kay.
I was going to say currently, any males between 18 and 25 do have to sign up with the Selective Service.
They do.
There is not a draft, but
That's correct.
that's
Well,
one
it's
of
not
the
a
things.
draft. No, that is not the draft,
Right,
however.
it's not the draft. They have to register
That is
with the
correct.
Selective Service.
That is
And
correct.
I was just reading that as of, let's see, December 2026, it will
Yes,
become automatic, eliminating the need for
that is correct.
self-registration.
That is correct. I guess
So,
because a high percentage of people don't know the law or they never get around to enrolling in that selective service program. I remember I had to do it at my local post office when I turned 18. And I realized why they're doing that. It's to quickly mobilize people or at least contact people. I don't know, am I required to update them on my contact information? 18, heck, that was 45 years ago. I've never sent them a forwarding address. I'm certainly, I've aged out of military service age, but that's the reason why they have it, I think, at all, just to see how many eligible men are out there to serve in that role.
mhm.
So thank you for that, Kay. Yeah.
Okay, before we go to the next question, just a reminder to people, I'm seeing a number of things going into chat.
Whoa.
If you have a question, please put it in Q&A.
Oh,
That's where I'm monitoring questions.
oh.
Um, because to have to monitor two can get
Sure.
hard. So please
Understandable.
put questions over in Q&A, not in chat.
And
Um,
Kay, I'm sorry to interrupt, but before, again, just to repeat, I don't know how many questions are in chat and or in Q&A because I can't see that on my screen. But if
right.
any of you listening today wants to continue this discussion, please feel free to send me an email. You don't even have to request the PowerPoint that I showed. You can just say, well, you said something. What do you think about this? Or I have a different take on this. And as long as you remember, again, my name is Richard. I teach at Gustavus. You will find my email address, and I would welcome any input at all, and I will quickly reply to whatever you send me. So if we can't get through all the questions and the comments, then that's how we could do it.
Okay, well, let's keep going.
Okay?
If you were advising the US government, what
Yeah.
policies would you push for China, dealing with
Oh.
China?
Oh, that's a great question. I first would say that we should have more people in the United States learning Chinese. That would probably be my first one, but that's a long-term prospect, no doubt about it. Chinese is not a very easy language to master, as you probably know, but there are probably a lot of unidentified people who would be great candidates simply because they've got that certain type of brain and they could do it. So I would encourage more presentation of Chinese at earlier levels of education, and then try to fully finance people who are saying, I'm going to learn Chinese. A certain percentage will drop out, a certain percentage would never want to work for the US government. But the more people we have in our government who can understand Chinese language and also have been to China plenty of times where they have some level of expertise, the more beneficial it would be for us. So that would be my first go-to. What else would I do? Well, I would try to encourage our allies to think about China as not only an opportunity, but more as a threat than they possibly do right now. And there are a lot of countries that are just looking at the bottom line and saying, well, China trade is beneficial for us in many ways. But I don't know if many of them realize what the potential military threat is, especially with something like China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I didn't even talk about today. Some of you are probably familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative. China decided that it was going to build infrastructure throughout what we call the developing world, where back in the Cold War day was referred to as the third world. So China has approached a lot of governments throughout the developing world and said, you know, we can electrify your country, or we can make bridges here, or we can do other things related to infrastructure that will improve your quality of life. And is there some underhanded objective of the Chinese government by doing that so they can make the movement of military capabilities much easier for future wars in some of these countries, or maybe squaring off against the United States? Who knows? But if you look at a map of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative projects throughout the world, it is vast, you know, very expansive. And a lot of these countries now are on the hook for so much money that they were fronted the money by the Chinese government, but they paid for the projects, essentially, the Chinese government, but it was in the form of loans. And a lot of those countries are going to be in arrears for quite some time because they just don't have the economic capability to repay those loans. And then what's going to happen? Is the Chinese government going to take possession of some of those infrastructure projects? Well, if it were to do that, then it's even closer to some of our allies. And those allies might not even be thinking in that way, that China might be on your doorstep, people, because Laos has just defaulted on a loan, for example. And now the Chinese government is taking possession of that bridge or that tunnel or that electrification plant. And now they're even closer than you thought, Vietnam, in a different direction or whatever it might be. And maybe the Vietnam example is not appropriate because Vietnam certainly is very concerned about Chinese encroachment. And that's historical too. That goes back centuries. But other countries that just might not be thinking in that way, maybe they should be thinking in that way. So thank you. Thank you for that question.
Okay. And in terms of learning Chinese, I'm thinking you mean Mandarin versus
Oh,
Cantonese.
yes, absolutely. Mandarin.
So,
Right. And the other thing to remember is, again, China, they aren't stupid in China. And I mean the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party, which are essentially one and the same. But Chinese people themselves aren't stupid people. No way. So what's the result of all of this? The Chinese government said early on in their education that Chinese kids are going to learn English. And right now they have more than 300 million speakers of English in China. And most of them are not at native proficiency, but at least conversational proficiency. 300 million, that's almost the entire population of the United States, that they can communicate with us, but we can't communicate with them. And it's just one way. And you would think that they're benefiting from that relationship. And I think they clearly are. So yeah, we have to have more speakers of Mandarin and readers of Mandarin. I guess you really don't have to do that because guess what, Kay? Right now, I can just hold up my phone and it can do everything for me. And why go through that rigor and horror of having to learn all those 5,000 kanji, you know? But yeah, it would be nice if we had more people really understanding China. Right?
okay. And in terms of what you were talking about, I think this, in terms of like the infrastructure, I think this next question deals with this. Would you please comment on the impact of China's work in Africa now that the U.S. has ended U.S. aid?
That's a great question. That is a great question. Uh, Yeah, that was a very short-sighted decision by the United States government to end USAID, which was a frontline example of soft power of the United States in whatever form it took, whether it was in the form of food relief. It said this donation brought to you by the people of the United States, clearly on it. If it was in the form of educating people or giving them other, benefits of quality of life, uh, that was just so important. And it was detrimental to all the people who lost their jobs. And it's going to be really hard to recover from that, just such a stupid decision. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. It was so pointless. I guess it was the low-hanging fruit. And when people are saying the United States sends too much money abroad and they focus on foreign aid, it's just an absolute smidgen of the overall federal government budget. It's just so sad to think that they decided to cut it. Well, anyway, getting back to the question, I'm sorry for all that
No?
context, but getting back to the question, China has had long-standing relations with almost every African nation state, and that started in the 1960s when Mao Zedong was just starting his what was called the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, which we know as the Cultural Revolution. What was the point? Well, people said that there's no way that Mao, who was inward looking and trying to prop up his regime and survive and focusing on the youth of China, would ever have any interest in going outside of China, especially to a place like Africa, and try to have relationships. Well, that's really not true because that is what happened. China decided that there were a lot of countries, Mao, excuse me, not China, but there were a lot of countries that might be influenced by Mao's version of communism. And he started these relationships in the 1960s. The first was with Zambia. And China decided that Zambia was a very important place to have relationships with because Zambia has a lot of copper. And then what happened? Well, Zambia, Tanzania suddenly now are fans and allies of China. China decides they're going to build a railroad, and they're going to build this railroad that's going to take copper from Zambia through Tanzania, and it's going to be exported to China. And these are long-standing relationships that China has with every country in the African continent. There are more than 50 of them. The only country that China doesn't have formal diplomatic relations with, and somebody in the group probably knows this, is formerly known as Swaziland, now known as Eswatini. And the reason why is Eswatini is one of only a handful of countries on the entire planet that still recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate government of China. And for that reason, China says, nope, no, we're not going to have anything to do with you. But for the 53 other countries in Africa, yeah, China has a relationship with every single one of them. And that is only going to become stronger now that the United States has essentially withdrawn through the presence of USAID workers. Stupid, really, really stupid. But China can, China can operate smoothly in African nation states. There's only one democratically elected country in the African continent, and it's actually not physically on the African continent, but it's Mauritius. It's considered for geographic purposes part of Africa. But all the other countries are non-democratically determined governments. So China can just operate freely in Africa without the concern of whether this country is democratic or not, whether it's depriving its people human rights or not, which would always be a qualifier for the United States. Do you really want to work with somebody like Muammar Gaddafi in Libya? You don't. He was a thug. But China didn't find
So
any problem with that. Yeah, please.
South Africa isn't democratic?
South Africa is democratic. They do have free and fair elections, but according to the Democracy Index, which I know now it's technical, but South Africa has so many problems that
Okay.
according to these people who evaluate whether a democracy is full-fledged or partially or whatever, the only full-fledged democracy they
Is
claim
Mauritius? Okay.
is Mauritius. But yes, South Africa legalized gay marriage. So just on that one aspect alone, we could say that they are concerned about and they are upholding human rights, in contrast to other nation states in Africa, which have severe penalties if somebody is gay and or they try to marry. But the ANC in South Africa has a lot of problems. And they're also considered highly corrupt and all kinds of problems there, domestically with the partisan politics things that according to this organization that ranks democracies, they say that we can't really fully, with sincerity say that South Africa is a democracy. So thanks for that, Kay. Good.
Okay, quick plug. Summer's session for Great Decisions is U.S. engagement in Africa.
Oh, there we go.
And that's June 5th.
Oh, nice. Very good.
Okay, does China currently have a strategic advantage over the U.S. with respect to AI research, technology, and manufacturing capabilities? And if so, do you have any suggestions on how to narrow the gaps?
Wow. This is a great question. I cannot claim to be the AI authority. As far as I know, the most dynamic AI breakthroughs are happening in the United States, and we still have a leg up on China in AI. But I don't know enough about China's state of AI to say something authoritatively like, oh, yes, clearly this percentage of this or that. I don't know. But from what I understand, the United States is still leading that AI race. The difference is, however, that the United States is doing it through private investment, with, again, showing you those earlier slides, that the United States has taken some ownership stake in buying those shares of those companies. So the United States might think it can somehow persuade those companies to do X, Y, and Z, whether it's rare earths or AI or whatever else that's deemed national security significant. But for the United States, it's mostly private ownership. And in China's case, it's all government backed. And they have the resources of a government, which clearly overwhelm the private marketplace. So if China is full on in AI, they've got the money to back it up. And for us, we've got the investors to back it up. So who's going to win out? The government resources, the private marketplace investor resources? I don't know. But I know that people are trying to come to Silicon Valley and they want to get involved in AI. And I don't know many people who are saying, I want to go to China and I want to really develop and see those opportunities in AI. No, it's still the Mecca in Southern California where people want to be. So good. That's a great question. Thank you for that AI research capabilities question.
Okay. Are the developing countries under the Chinese umbrella learning to speak Mandarin?
Uh, that's a great question. I can't answer that. I don't know. I would assume that they are. I would assume that a lot of strings come with any of those loans that are provided by the Chinese government, whether it is through the Belt and Road Initiative or just simply bilateral foreign aid. I'm assuming that the Chinese government is insisting that a positive spin be shown to the people who are the recipients of Chinese benevolence. So are they speaking Chinese? I would think, yes, they are. And maybe the Chinese government had said to people, that are looking for opportunities, this is the way you're going to change your life course. If you learn Chinese, then you can have all of these opportunities or something, not dissimilar from the way the United States spread English throughout the developing world. We think about that too. So maybe China is going to not replace English as the lingua franca of the planet, but it might just be competitive with English someday. But again, just, it's so much easier to understand 26 letters compared to 5,000 kanji. It's just the simplicity of English compared to other languages that might compete with the United States and our use of English. I don't know. So yeah, but that's a great question. Great. Thank you for that one too.
There's like four left, and I'm just like,
Well,
I'm gonna go with the short one just
okay.
because. How do you see the social issues in China, such as aging, low
Yeah.
birth rate, in their abilities to sustain their goals?
Oh, that is a great question. It is a wonderful question. The low birth rate and the one-child policy, they're all wrapped up in the same demographic population problem in China. So we are seeing a demographic time bomb in China, which we are seeing also in Japan. The difference, however, is that Japan is about 1/10 the population size of China. So the repercussions in China are much more profound than they are in Japan. But just seeing what's happening in Japan now is problematic. Well, in China's case, with the one-child policy at its peak, I guess we could say, there were 120 males for every 100 females, which of course has created all kinds of social problems. There are not enough women to marry. As a result, you see people who are bride smuggling. They're going to North Korea and literally abducting people from North Korea to marry Chinese men. It's just horrible, absolutely horrible. The low birth rate problem, well, yeah, the Chinese government is now trying to reverse that one-child mandate, which existed for more than 3 decades. And people were told, well, you're going to face the consequences. If you have a second child, child will be considered a black child, not racially black, but not recognized by the government. That child will not be able to have an education. That child will be deprived of, this, that, the other. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. Well, now those black children are in their 20s or 30s, and what has happened to their lives. They've just been essentially X'd out of all existence in the Chinese government's view. Well, now the Chinese government said, oh, yes, people can have more than one child. Well, more recently, they've encouraged people to have 3 children. Well, in a very hyper-competitive society like China, where there's a limited number of resources and everybody wants their one child to be exceptional, parents are just making a very pragmatic, calculated decision. If we have more than one child, then we're going to divide those resources among 2 children or possibly 3 children. And that child or those children will now be less competitive. Who in their right mind would ever do that to their child? So even though the Chinese government has incentivized families to have more than one child, they can't force people to do that. They are in some parts of China supposedly carrying out forced vasectomies. Is that really going to happen? Who knows? Why would they do that if they don't want people to not have one child? Why are they doing this? They're trying to figure out other ways to make people, incentivize birth, marriage. There are very few out of wedlock marriages, honestly, in China, just like Japan. So you're not going to find many single moms. Maybe we're going to see that in the future if they incentivize it enough and say, we'll provide for your children, regardless of how many you have. Even in the United States, it's very limited. It's just a myth that women end up having lots of kids for government support. I can imagine it would be even more onerous and really stingy in China. But that's a great question. You're onto it. There's a lot of social issues in China, and the Chinese government realizes that it's as a result of the low birth rate and the former one-child policy. They can't get enough workers. They're not going to be able to man their military posts and all the rest of that only humans are going to be able to do. And AI is going to fill in some of the gap, of course, but not all of it. So,
Okay, well, we are officially over our
okay.
time, but I just put in chat, I put Richard's
Oh,
email
thank you for that,
address.
Kay. Oh, that makes it easier for people. Thank you for
So
doing that.
please go ahead, copy that right now.
Thank you.
If we did not get to your question, feel free to email Richard with
Thank you.
that. Because yeah, this was great. We had so many questions that it was hard to get to all of them. And thank you everyone for submitting questions and comments.
Thank you.
Um, and we can also, I think Grayson could email you the ones that we didn't get to
That would be great. Thank you,
also,
Kate, for
just to look at.
moderating. Thanks so much for all of those questions that were asked too, and everybody for being so attentive and so thoughtful. It was great questions. Yeah.
Yep. So thanks everyone for participating, and thank you, Richard, for
Thank
sharing
you all.
your insights and knowledge. We appreciate all of that.
You're
So
very
I want
great.
to tell everyone, go out and have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you back here on June 5th.
Thank you.
Yep. So for the next great decisions. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.